Poirot held up the original. "They match in design, but not in wear." Rickman stepped in behind the constable. "He caught someone retrieving it, or attempting to," Poirot corrected. Rickman looked grim. The doctor, all eyes swung to Dr. Larch, who had shrunk back in his chair. Poirot's tone sharpened. "You have been quiet, Doctor. Too quiet and too helpful. Always present, always ready to confirm, and always the first to arrive when someone dies." Larch's voice cracked. "I didn't kill him. I swear it." "You retrieved the key," Poirot said. "To what end?" I was told to hide the passage. Years ago. By Gregory himself. He feared what Thomas would do. He said it had to be kept sealed, forgotten. I only followed orders." Poirot stepped gear, pushing forward. "Did you kill Thomas Hollingbury?" "No," Larch cried. "But I found him. I found him already gone. Gregory said not to ask questions. I signed the certificate because I owed him." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Then what of Maltravers?" Larch hesitated. "He came to me 2 days before he died. He told me he was going to change everything, that a second will would be read, that the house and the estate would be split. He said he feared for his life." "And what did you do?" "I told him to leave. I begged him to go back to London. But he stayed, and then he died." Larch slumped in his chair, shaking. "I didn't kill anyone. I was afraid." Poirot studied him, then gave a single nod. "I believe you did not kill Maltravers, but you allowed a death, and that, too, is a crime." He turned to the others. "The murderer, however, is still at large. Someone clever, someone desperate." He paused. "And soon they will act again." The wind howled outside. Somewhere, deep within the house, a panel creaked. Not the door, the walls themselves, and Poirot smiled just slightly. "The trap," he said, "is nearly closed." Chapter 12. The Confrontation. The storm that night was unlike the others. It did not roll in with theatrics or warn of its arrival. It simply descended, heavy, absolute, draping Hollingbury Grange in a blackness so complete it seemed to swallow the lamps from within. Lightning flashed only once an hour, as if rationed by nature. The wind had settled into long, dragging moans against the windows, like the sighs of something long buried. And still the house waited. Poirot stood alone in the drawing-room. The fire had long since died, and he had not asked for it to be relit. Instead, he kept vigil by the cold grate, his silhouette fixed against the tall windows. He had instructed the constables to remain stationed at the east and west corridors. No one was to enter or leave without passing their notice. No doors were to be opened, except the one he expected. The guests had all been sent to bed early, though none, he was sure, had actually slept. It was past midnight now, and the house had reached the perfect stillness required for truth to surface. A faint sound broke it, soft, too soft for a footstep, more like a breath on wood. Poirot did not move, but his eyes flicked to the grandfather clock. It was 12:43, exactly as he had predicted. He exited the drawing-room in silence, and moved down the west corridor. The constable at the far end nodded at him, confused but obeying Poirot's gesture to remain still. Poirot reached the guest room, the room where both Thomas Hollingbury and Leonard Maltravers had met their ends. The door was ajar. A faint glow flickered from within. Not candlelight, too steady. An electric torch. Poirot stepped inside and found Viola Hollingbury kneeling by the old writing desk, her fingers deep in the hollow where the silver key had been. A small hand mirror lay beside her, used to peer into the compartment without being seen from the hallway. She turned at the sound of his step, her face pale and unreadable. Her mouth opened, not in surprise, but in something closer to resignation. "Knew it would be you," she said. Poirot nodded once. "I hoped it would be." She stood slowly. "I only came to see if you had found the other letter. I had to know." "There was no letter," Poirot said. "Just the key. And that was enough." Her hands trembled. "You think it was me?" "I know it was you." The room was silent for a long moment. Then she exhaled. Not sharply, but gently, like someone who had finally dropped a weight they'd carried too long. "You were never supposed to find the passage," she said. "No one was. My grandfather showed it to me once when I was a child. Said it was part of the old house's bones. Something private. He made me swear never to use it. But after he died, it was the only place in the house that felt like it still belonged to him. Still belonged to me." Poirot's voice was soft. "And when Mr. Maltravers told you he was changing the will, you feared you would lose everything." Viola looked away. "You don't know what it was like. Watching this house, my family's legacy, being turned into some stage for strangers. A Frenchman who's my uncle, a will that erases everything I was promised, and Maltravers smiling as if he were proud of what he'd uncovered." "You killed him," Poirot said quietly. She flinched. "He wouldn't stop. He said he would read the new will aloud in front of everyone the next morning. I begged him not to. He said I should be grateful, that I would still be left with a portion of the estate. A symbolic gesture. And you used the passage. I didn't. Plan it, I swear. But the key, I had kept it. I don't even know why. I saw him writing at the desk. I waited in the corridor. I thought, just take the letter. Just scare him. But when I reached for it, he turned." Her voice cracked. "I panicked. There was a letter opener on the desk. I didn't even feel my hand move. He fell instantly. No noise. I didn't mean to." She sank into the armchair beside the fireplace. Suddenly small. Poirot approached, but did not comfort her. "You silenced him. You destroyed the letter. And then you reopened the corridor door to create confusion." She nodded, barely audible. "I opened the wrong door, the outer one. It made everything worse." "You then stole the envelope from Mrs. Selby, hid the key, framed Lady Wexham with the cyanide, because you had once seen her cleaning jewelry. It was all careful, all clever." Her eyes filled. "I never meant to kill Thomas. That wasn't me. That was years ago. I believe you." Poirot said. She looked up. "But 2 deaths have marked this house. 2 men silenced, one out of loyalty, one out of fear. That cannot go unanswered." There was a long pause. "What will you do?" she whispered. "I will tell the truth," Poirot said. "Always the truth. It is not my place to punish. That belongs to the courts. But justice must walk freely. Outside, the storm had begun to ease. The first light of dawn crept behind the black clouds, barely perceptible. As Viola was led away, not in handcuffs, but with quiet dignity, Poirot remained behind in the room where so much had ended. He looked once more to the fireplace, where the ashes of letters and lies had long since cooled. Then he turned and closed the door, gently for once. This time it did not open again. Chapter 13. A desperate attempt to escape. The confession should have ended it. Viola had admitted to the crime. She had named the motive, explained the method, the missing key, the secret passage, the silenced letter. All the pieces fell neatly into place, like a puzzle locking shut. And yet Poirot did not sleep that night. He sat in his quarters, the small lamp beside him casting a pool of light across the desk where he had arranged every note, every photograph, every sketch of the estate's layout. Something still pulled at him, something quiet and resistant, like a thread left dangling in an otherwise perfect suit. By morning, Inspector Rickman had arranged for Viola to be transferred under guard to the Eastleigh-on-Grey station. The constables were instructed to escort her quietly before the rest of the household stirred. She did not protest. She packed a single bag, walked with straight shoulders, and uttered not a word as she stepped into the car. Poirot watched her go from the library window, his fingers resting lightly on the sill. "She walks like someone who believes it's over," he murmured. Rickman stood beside him, arms folded. "She confessed, Poirot. You heard it yourself." "Oui," Poirot said, "but even the truth can be dressed in fine clothing." Rickman frowned. "You think she lied?" "No, I believe she told the truth, just not all of it." The inspector sighed. "Poirot, we've got the means, motive, opportunity." "And yet," Poirot interrupted gently, "a man like Gregory Hollingbury does not hand over the key to a secret passage to only one grandchild, especially when another already knew how to use it." Rickman narrowed his eyes. "Who are you thinking of?" Poirot didn't answer. He turned from the window and crossed the hallway to the east wing. The section of the house declared closed, forgotten, lifeless. But the dust had been disturbed, just barely. Footprints not recent, but not ancient either. Poirot crouched, touching the edge of one. Size 10, a man's. Later that day, a scream tore through the Grange, shrill, terrified. It came from Alice Derrington. Poirot arrived at her, jar just as Lucien burst from the opposite hall. Alice stood shaking, one hand against the wall, the other pointing toward her writing desk. "My letters," she gasped. "Someone went through them. They're gone." Rickman arrived seconds later, and the room was quickly searched. Indeed, several papers had been taken, mostly personal correspondence. A few from Florence, one from a gallery in London. "What did they want?" Rickman asked. Alice was pale, her voice hollow. "I don't know. None of those letters were about the estate. They were just mine." Poirot glanced at the empty drawer, then back at Alice. "You were close to Viola once, were you not?" "We were children together," she said, swallowing. "But things changed. She grew harder after Thomas died. I always thought she blamed me." Poirot nodded slowly. "You mentioned earlier that Maltravers seemed afraid. Did he confide anything in you?" "No." She looked down. "But I think he wanted to. He tried twice to speak to me alone. I avoided him. I didn't want to be involved." Poirot said nothing, but the thought that had tugged at him all night was now tightening around his chest like a well-knotted tie. Something didn't fit. That evening, a second carriage arrived at the Grange. It was meant to collect Lady Wexham and Sir Cedric. Both had requested to leave following Viola's arrest, but Poirot had asked for a short delay. He insisted on one more conversation with Sir Cedric. They met in the conservatory. "Monsieur Barnes," Poirot began, "did you know that Gregory Hollingbury had altered the second will to name only one beneficiary?" Sir Cedric's mouth twitched. "I assumed it was split." "No, he left everything to Lucian Frey, entirely." Sir Cedric's eyes narrowed. "And Viola?" "Nothing," Poirot said softly. "Nothing at all. A deliberate gesture." Cedric scoffed. "I find that hard to believe." "Of course you do," Poirot said, "because you made sure no one ever saw that version." The silence that followed was thick and cold. Poirot continued. "You intercepted the letter Maltravers gave to Mrs. Selby. You searched her cupboard. You used the hidden passage, which you pretended not to know existed, and took it." Cedric's voice dropped. "You're accusing me now?" "I am not accusing. I am explaining what you already know. You think I killed Maltravers?" "Think I killed Maltravers?" "No," Poirot said. "I believe Viola did that. But you killed Thomas Hollingbury." The colour drained from Sir Cedric's face. Poirot pressed on. "Thomas was going to expose everything. The affair, the concealed marriage, the first will. You stopped him before he could. Then you helped Gregory create a cleaner narrative. One heir, one line of succession. When Gregory died, you thought it was over." Poirot stepped closer. "But then Maltravers discovered the second will, and you watched as Viola made her own desperate decision. And you let her do it, because it protected you." Sir Cedric's voice was gravel. "You can't prove any of this." Poirot's voice remained calm. "No, but I can prove that you attempted to flee tonight by slipping out through the east exit during Alice's staged distraction. Rickman entered then, holding a muddy pair of boots and a coat, both found near the greenhouse." "Shall I read him his rights now?" the inspector asked. Sir Cedric didn't reply. He turned, walked to the edge of the room, and sat heavily on the iron bench beneath the frost-bitten window. "I tried to protect the family," he muttered. "The name, the house, what does it matter now?" Poirot stood in the doorway, his silhouette sharp in the moonlight. "It matters because justice does not bend for legacy, monsieur. It bends for truth." Outside, the storm had passed. The night was still, and for the first time in a week, the door did not open. Chapter 14. The final piece falls into place. By morning, the house had settled into a peculiar stillness, not the tense quiet of fear or secrecy, but a reluctant calm, like a storm that had passed, leaving behind the debris of truth for others to sift through. Sir Cedric was no longer at the Grange. After a brief and wordless breakfast, he had been escorted to Eastleigh-on-Grey under formal suspicion for obstruction of justice and suspected involvement in the death of Thomas Hollingbury. The official charges were still forming, but the pieces were now too firmly aligned to ignore. Viola remained at the station under observation, her confession still incomplete in the eyes of the law, especially in light of what Poirot had revealed. The knowledge that her crime had been committed under the shadow of a deeper deceit weighed heavily, softening the public's view, but not absolving it. And yet Poirot did not rest. For all the pieces that had been uncovered, the secret passage, the false inheritance, the buried heir, the dual motives, there remained one detail that haunted him. One detail that hadn't belonged. He found it again, late that afternoon, in the guest bedroom where Maltravers had died. Everyone else avoided the room now, even the constables, but Poirot returned to it, his movements slow, almost reverent. The storm had stained the corners of the wallpaper, leaving watermarks like tears. The fireplace sat unused, but someone had cleaned it recently, far too recently, and that was the detail. Poirot crouched beside the grate. The ashes were swept, yes, but too clean. He used a glove to press gently around the inner lining of the hearth, and there it was, a scrap of paper lodged in the stonework, charred, brittle, but intact enough to read a few words, to be held until further notice, should Mr. Maltravers. Poirot stared at it for a long moment. This was not part of the letter found at the desk. This was something else. A third document, possibly the original will. Someone had tried to burn it recently. Someone who hadn't known Poirot had already found evidence elsewhere. He stood brushing ash from his sleeve and walked briskly down the corridor. He found Alice Derrington in the gallery, sketchbook in hand, though she wasn't drawing, just staring out the window at the fog still curling over the moors. "A beautiful view, mademoiselle," he said gently. She flinched slightly, then smiled without warmth. "Not when you know what's out there." Poirot approached. "You loved Viola once, as a friend." "Yes," she said. "But grief changes people. It changed her. She stopped trusting anyone. She never smiled after her uncle died, because she suspected someone had helped him along, no?" Alice didn't answer. Poirot walked past her, his tone casual. "You gave her someone to hate. You were the only witness to Thomas's moods, the one person who could have overheard his doubts." Alice turned. "Are you accusing me now?" "No, I am observing, that's all." He paused. "But you see, mademoiselle, someone attempted to destroy a will in the fireplace 2 nights ago. Not Viola, not Sir Cedric. They were both under watch. Someone with access. Someone who had already lost much, and feared losing more." Alice's throat moved with a tight swallow. "I don't know what you're talking about." Poirot's gaze softened. "You loved Gregory Hollingbury." Silence. He continued. "You were young when you first met him. You were not family, not a peer, just a girl who came to stay. He offered you kindness, encouragement, perhaps more." Alice shook her head, but too slowly. "You weren't in the will, Alice, and that angered you. You resented Viola, the family. the way the house passed hands like property. Tears brimmed in her eyes. He said he'd change it. Poirot stepped forward. He never did. And when Maltravers tried to set it right, you saw your chance slipping again. So you took the real will and tried to destroy it, because even Lucien's inheritance was not yours. A single tear slipped down her cheek. I didn't kill anyone. No, Poirot agreed. But you ensured the truth was delayed. And that too has its consequences. She sank slowly into the window seat, burying her face in her hands. Poirot left her there without another word. In the study, Poirot laid out the timeline on the desk for Rickman, whose respect had grown with each passing day. The first death. The first death. Thomas Hollingbury, orchestrated by Sir Cedric, to silence him before he could expose the first marriage and demand a new succession. The second death, Maltravers, an act of desperation by Viola, who believed she had no other way to keep the life she knew. And finally, the attempted destruction of the original will by Alice Derrington, motivated not by greed, but by bitter disappointment. Rickman sighed. God help them all. Poirot nodded. Indeed. Rickman tapped the burnt paper scrap. So what happens now? Poirot folded his hands. Now, Inspector, justice must sort itself out. One confession will stand. Another will be buried in paperwork. A third, perhaps in memory alone. But the house? He glanced out the window toward the looming shape of Hollingbury Grange. The house is finally quiet. That evening, Poirot packed his bag with methodical care. His silver-handled brush, his watch, his journal. Before he closed the lid, he took one last look around the room. He walked once more to the west corridor, now lit, swept, and no longer feared. He opened the infamous door. It creaked gently, as all doors do. No mystery, no ghosts, only the wind, and Poirot, smiling faintly to himself, let it close for the final time. Chapter 50. The final gathering. It was the kind of morning that followed great storms. Deceptively calm, with a grey sky stretched thin over the moors, and the scent of wet earth rising from the gardens. Hollingbury Grange sat in the silence of aftermath, its stone facade darker from the rain, its windows clouded with condensation, as if the house itself had exhaled. Inside, the remaining guests moved with the hesitancy of those waking from an uneasy dream. They had not yet been told what Poirot intended, only that he had called for them to gather one last time in the drawing-room, the same place where the door had opened, where the lies began to unravel, and where now the truth would be sewn back together. At precisely 10 o'clock they arrived, Lucien Frey, still pale but upright, his expression unreadable, Lady Wexham, adorned in black, and clinging to a sense of dignity like it were armour. Dr. Larch, gaunt and silent, seated far from the fire. Alice Derrington, subdued, her eyes ringed with sleeplessness, and Inspector Rickman, standing at the rear of the room, notebook in hand, though he would not need it today. Poirot stood by the fireplace. The crackle of the flames behind him was the only sound. "Mes amis," he began softly, We have come to the end." They said nothing. Their silence had become a kind of ritual. Poirot looked at each of them in turn. When I arrived, I was told a door had opened by itself. A door long sealed. A symbol of something uncanny. Something supernatural, perhaps. He paused. "But as I have often found in my career, what we call ghosts are often guilt. Secrets with breath." He began to pace slowly, his hands clasped lightly behind his back. This mystery was never just about one murder. It was a chain, a sequence of deceptions and decisions, each entangled with the last. One secret gave birth to another, until the house itself groaned with them. Poirot turned to Lucian. "You were the heir no one knew. The child of Gregory Hollingbury's first annulled marriage, raised far from the Grange, forgotten, until Mr. Maltravers, with conscience at last, sought to bring the truth into the light." Lucien nodded once, tight-lipped. Poirot shifted to Lady Wexham. "You, madam, aided in the concealment of that first marriage. Whether out of loyalty or preservation, it matters not. You chose silence, and that silence cost others their legacy." Wexham stared into the fire, unmoved, then to Dr. Larch. "You signed 2 death certificates, one out of obligation, the other out of fear. In doing so, you allowed deception to flourish. Perhaps you did not kill, but you permitted those who did to pass unnoticed." Larch closed his eyes. Poirot moved next to Alice Derrington, his voice gentle. "And you, mademoiselle, were both witness and accomplice. You burned the remnants of the first will, not for gain, but to punish the dead for promises they did not keep. You believed yourself forgotten, so you returned the favor." Alice's mouth quivered, but she said nothing. Finally, Poirot turned to the empty chair in the circle, the one left for Viola. She acted in desperation, a woman who believed her world was slipping through her fingers. She killed Leonard Maltravers not as a strategist, but as a frightened heir whose inheritance was being rewritten before her eyes. Poirot folded his hands. "But what Viola did not know, what none of you knew, was that Gregory Hollingbury, in his final act of clarity, had changed his mind once again. A third will, unsigned, sat hidden in the desk's secret compartment. A draft prepared but never filed." Poirot retrieved a folded document from his coat. It named both Viola and Lucien as joint heirs, equal in share, equal in legacy. A stunned hush fell over the room. It was never about choosing one bloodline over another. It was about mending both. Gregory Hollingbury, flawed though he was, sought peace in his final hour. But he delayed, as the weak often do. And so the peace he intended became a battleground for those left behind. He laid the document on the table beside him, unopened. "This will has no legal power. It bears no seal, but it holds moral weight. And I believe those of you still present must decide whether to honor it or discard it, as others have done before you." Lucian stood slowly. "I have no interest in the estate. Not any more. Let Viola have it." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Then let her hear you say it." Lucian paused, then looked at the chair across from him. "She can have it, Lady Wexham." Scott. Lady Wexham scoffed. So it ends with sentiment? No, Poirot said. It ends with truth. Whether you honor it or not, that is no longer my concern. He stepped away from the hearth, his voice lowering. You all came to this house carrying ghosts, and now they are yours to keep or to bury. He gave a small bow. Inspector Rickman cleared his throat. I'll be seeing to the paperwork. Dr. Larch and Miss Derrington will be asked to give formal statements. Lady Wexham, the Crown may wish to question you further, but there is no immediate charge. As for Lucien, I imagine you'll be returning to Paris. Lucien didn't answer. He only stared out the rain-misted window. One by one, they drifted from the room, as if released from a trance. Poirot remained until the fire had burned low. Only then did he retrieve his hat and coat. As he stepped into the drizzle outside, the Grange loomed behind him, no longer menacing but weary, as if it too had said all it needed to say. And somewhere behind its shuttered windows, the infamous west door sat closed, not locked, not feared, simply closed for good. Chapter 16. The Reveal Hollingbury Grange had never known such quiet. 2 days had passed since the final gathering, and yet Poirot remained. Not because the law required it, nor because he doubted his conclusions. He remained because something within him refused to let go. That subtle itch in the mind, the one that whispered when all others said it was over. But Poirot knew better. For him, there was always one more thing. He spent the morning in the drawing-room, rereading the statements taken from each guest, and seemed reviewing every discovered artifact, the duplicate keys, the burnt paper, the unfinished letter, and the unsigned will. He looked at them not as individual clues, but as parts of a single orchestration. And slowly, quietly, he began to see what others had not. At noon he called once more for a gathering, this time not of the household, but of the principal. Players still within reach, Lucien Frey, Alice Derrington, Inspector Rickman, and, brought from the Eastleigh-on-Grey station by arrangement, Viola Hollingbury. They were surprised, each of them, tired, hollow-eyed. Viola wore no expression at all. She moved like a person unmoored from consequence, numb to her surroundings, accepting of her fate. The gathering took place not in the drawing-room nor the grand dining hall, but in Gregory Hollingbury's study, the room where no guest had ever lingered long. Here the wood-panelled walls still bore the scent of pipe smoke, the heavy furniture as unmoved as the secrets it once held. Poirot stood behind the desk, his fingers lightly resting on the carved edge. "Why are we here?" Viola asked flatly. "To tell you something you deserve to know," Poirot replied. "Something none of you were meant to learn. Not from Gregory Hollingbury, and not from Leonard Maltravers." They waited. No one spoke. Poirot opened a slim envelope, aged and brittle, pulled from the hidden compartment of the desk. Not the one containing the unsigned will, but a separate overlooked packet. "This," he said, "is the first letter Gregory wrote to Maltravers. The one he never sent. It predates the second will. It reveals what Gregory truly intended, not what he told Sir Cedric, not what he confided in Lady Wexham, but what he believed in his final days." He began to read. "I have come to accept that my actions in youth, however veiled by society's judgment, were cowardly. Helena deserved more than silence, and the child we created deserves more than exile. I wish to undo what time and pride have allowed to fester. The estate shall go to Lucien entirely. Viola, whom I love deeply, will receive the remainder of my personal savings, as I believe she is strong enough to build her own life. It is not a slight, it is a gift of freedom. Viola stiffened. Poirot continued, I know this will cause pain, but the truth must be made clean, if not kind. Maltravers, you must be the one to carry it out. I no longer trust Cedric. He has grown too fond of the illusion we created. Poirot lowered the paper. This was Gregory's true intent, not the unsigned will, not the one split evenly. That draft was created after Sir Cedric intervened, persuaded him to reconsider. The draft with equal inheritance was never meant to exist. Lucien looked stunned. Alice looked down at the floor. Rickman shifted uncomfortably, but Viola's expression did not change. So, I killed a man to protect something that was never mine. Poirot didn't answer that. Instead, he said softly, You killed a man because you believed you had been wronged. The tragedy is that you were right, but not in the way you imagined. He let the words settle like dust. No one told you the truth. Not your grandfather, not Sir Cedric, not even Maltravers, who waited too long to act. They left you to discover it by force. Poirot turned to Lucien. You have always said you do not want the estate. Lucien nodded. I still don't. Not now. Not like this. Poirot gestured. To the letter. Then it is yours. What you do with it is no longer of my concern. Lucien stood slowly. I'll have it auctioned. The house, the land. I'll divide the proceeds evenly. Viola and I will split it. Quietly. No lawyers. No press. Viola blinked, as if something cracked deep behind her eyes. Why? Because, Lucien said, we were both lied to. No one spoke for a long time. Poirot stepped out from behind the desk. There is one more truth, he said quietly, that must be told. They turned to him again. Leonard Maltravers did not die from a blow to the head. That is what Viola believed, and what the coroner was led to believe due to the angle of his fall and the bleeding near the temple. He paused. In fact, he died from cardiac arrest, likely caused by digitalis, a plant-based poison derived from foxglove. Rickman stiffened. What? But you said... I said what I knew at the time, Poirot replied. But the toxicology report arrived this morning. A small amount of digitalis was found in his system, enough to cause heart failure under the right conditions. And we know Maltravers already had a weak heart. Viola looked stunned. But I struck him with the letter opener. You startled him, Poirot said. You may have scratched him, but the dose was already working its way through his system. It had been administered earlier that day, likely in his tea. Alice whispered, Then who poisoned him? Poirot turned to the only person left, Dr. Larch. He had entered silently and now stood in the doorway, his face grey. I didn't mean for him to die that night, he said, his voice brittle. I thought he would feel ill, have chest pain, enough to delay the reading of the will. Enough time for Cedric and me to rethink everything. Poirot nodded. You feared the consequences of the second heir, of the unravelling. You had let Gregory talk you into certifying Thomas's death, and now you were about to be exposed. Blanche nodded slowly. But I swear, I never told Viola. Poirot believed him. He looked at Viola. You struck a man already dying. His death was accelerated by your actions, but it would have come regardless. The tragedy is not that you killed. The tragedy is that so many others allowed it to happen. He turned back to the room. This is the reveal, not of who killed whom, but of how silence kills more slowly and more thoroughly than any blade. He left the study, not as a victor, but as a man who had uncovered too much of the human soul. Behind him, the door to Gregory Hollingbury's study remained open. No one dared close it. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. The day after the reveal, Hollingbury Grange no longer felt like a house, but a relic, an empty monument to choices made in silence. The guests were gone. The constables had departed. The study door remained open, untouched by hand. It stood like a wound on the house itself, not to be closed, only endured. Poirot sat alone in the breakfast-room. The window beside him was clouded with moisture, softening the view of the gardens beyond. Rain had returned in misty drizzles, whispering against the panes with weary persistence. He sipped black coffee in silence. Inspector Rickman entered quietly and took the seat across from him. "It's done," he said. "Statement signed. Charges drafted." Poirot didn't respond immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the window. Rickman continued. "Dr. Larch will be prosecuted. Manslaughter, most likely. He's cooperating. Claims he intended only to delay Maltravers, not kill him." "And Viola?" Poirot asked, still not looking away. "She'll face trial," Rickman said. "But with everything we've learned, it may be reduced. The court might view her more as a tragic figure than a criminal one, especially given Maltravers' condition and the role Larch played." Poirot nodded slowly. "The law will speak then." He took another sip, then finally turned to Rickman. "But what of justice?" Rickman frowned. "Isn't that what I just described?" Poirot shook his head gently. "No, my friend, that is procedure. Justice is something else entirely." He stood and walked to the sideboard, adjusting his cuffs with practiced precision. "Justice," he said softly, "is when those who were wronged are hurt, not avenged, not repaid, simply acknowledged." By mid-morning, Lucien Frey had packed his bags. There was nothing dramatic about his departure. No farewells, no longing looks. Just the quiet zip of a suitcase and a car idling in the drive. Poirot found him in the foyer, adjusting his coat. "You are certain you will not stay?" Poirot asked. Lucien offered a thin smile. "And do what? Play lord of a house I never wanted. I was never meant to inherit this place, monsieur. It belongs to a memory that no longer fits." Poirot nodded. "Then what will you do?" "I'll go back to Paris, paint, live poorly and freely, as I always have, but with a cleaner mind." He paused, then added, "I've arranged for the house to be sold. The proceeds will be split. Viola's share to be held in trust until her release. The rest donated. To what cause? Poirot asked. Lucien looked around the grand hall, once filled with secrets. Education, for children who never learn their own stories. Poirot gave a slight bow. A poetic gesture, Monsieur Frey. Lucien chuckled. You'd be surprised what poetry can repair. They shook hands. When the car disappeared down the gravel drive, Poirot turned back toward the house, and he realized with a strange pang that he was the last guest remaining. Later that day, Poirot visited the jail at Eastleigh-on-Grey. Not to question, not to investigate, but to speak. Viola Hollingbury sat in a plain grey dress in the visiting room. Her hair was tied back. Her eyes were tired, but clearer than they had been in days. You came, she said quietly. Poirot sat opposite her. I owed you that, he replied. There was a silence between them. Not hostile, but heavy. Didn't mean to become this, she said. I wanted to protect something that felt like it belonged to me. Poirot nodded. And you learned too late that the past does not belong to us. We are merely its caretakers. Viola smiled faintly. I suppose I should say I'm sorry. He tilted his head. Do you feel sorry? She paused, then said, Yes, but not for the reason you might think. I'm not sorry for what I believed. I'm sorry for what I didn't question, for what I inherited blindly. Poirot folded his hands. That, mademoiselle, is the most honest thing you have said. That, mademoiselle, is the most honest thing you have said. They spoke no further. When he stood to leave, she said only, Merci, Monsieur Poirot. He bowed gently, and then he was gone. That evening, Poirot stood once more in the west corridor, alone. The door remained shut, not sealed, not locked, just shut. He approached it, laid a gloved hand on the wood, and stood there, still as a statue. You were never a ghost, he whispered. Only a warning. He opened the door. It creaked softly. No wind, no mystery. Behind it, the corridor was empty. He smiled, then slowly, gently, Poirot closed it again, this time not for silence, not for fear, but for peace. Chapter 18. The closing remark 2 days later, under the pale sun of a hesitant spring. Morning, Hercule Poirot departed Hollingbury Grange for the final time. The carriage, modest and dark, wound slowly down the gravel path. Behind him, the house stood still, not ominous now, nor proud, but emptied of something ancient. A place that had been untied from its illusions. Poirot sat with his gloved hands, resting lightly on his lap, his cane propped neatly beside him, and his thoughts for once permitted to wander. Cases like this did not come often. A death, certainly. But this was more. A death of inheritance, of legacy, of trust. The real tragedy had not been the murder of Maltravers, nor the secret passageways, nor the unsigned wills. It was the slow erosion of truth, and the ease with which memory could be weaponized, and in that way Hollingbury had not been a mystery. It had been a caution. From the village post office, Poirot sent a letter, handwritten, on his monogrammed stationery, the sort of note he reserved for only the most particular of conclusions. It was addressed to Judge Harmon Smythe, a friend of Poirot's from earlier legal collaborations in Sussex. My dear Harmon Smythe, I have just concluded a most peculiar case in Eastleigh-on-Grey, one that I suspect will interest you, not for its violence, but for its architecture, not the structure of the house, though that played its part, but the architecture of concealment, how a family can design generations of silence, and still be surprised when it collapses. What struck me most was not the discovery of who killed whom, that, as always, revealed itself in due course, but how easily people mistake inheritance for identity, as if receiving something gives you meaning rather than responsibility. There was a door, mon ami, a door that opened without reason. It became the symbol of this story. A ghost, some thought. But in the end, it was only wood, hinges, and timing. The true ghosts lived elsewhere, in letters unsent, names unspoken, and truths postponed too long. I will tell you the full tale some day over dinner. For now, know that justice was done, in the manner justice often prefers, imperfectly, humanely, and with a touch of irony. Yours, Hercule Poirot. That same afternoon, as the final solicitor removed the last box from Hollingbury Grange, a group of local workmen arrived to board up the east wing, not permanently, just to discourage any further curiosity. The estate was to be sold within the month, per Lucien Frey's instructions. The villagers speculated, of course. They spoke of the strange French detective with the waxed moustache, of the girl who had killed a man she could not stop loving, and of the will that had never been read aloud. Some said the house was cursed. Others had said it had been healed. Still others, the oldest among them, merely shook their heads and said that house always had a mind of its own. But they all agreed on one thing. The door never opened again. 3 weeks later, in a small courtroom in Sussex, Viola Hollingbury appeared before a magistrate. The charge, involuntary manslaughter. The judge, having reviewed the toxicology report, the testimony of Dr. Larche, and Poirot's own notes, issued a sentence that balanced punishment with mercy. 2 years suspended, 5 years probation, psychological care recommended. Viola stood straight as the sentence was read. She accepted it not as a defeat, but as a consequence finally earned. As she exited the courtroom, she passed Poirot, seated alone in the second row. She stopped for a moment, her eyes meeting his. "You could have destroyed me," she said. Poirot's expression was calm but kind. "No, mademoiselle, I merely allowed you to find the truth before it destroyed you." And she nodded once, not in gratitude, but in understanding. Then she was gone. On a quiet evening weeks later, Poirot returned to his London flat, unpacked his suitcase, and set about the simple joys of order. Brushing lint from his coat, polishing a stray scuff on his shoe, assigning his books back onto the shelf with near geometric perfection. But one item remained in the case longer than the rest. A photograph. Taken years earlier, black and white, slightly creased at the corner. It showed a much younger Gregory Hollingbury standing beside a woman, radiant, half laughing. In front of a summer garden, Helena Marston. Behind them, in the corner of the frame, just visible in the shade, stood a young Sir Cedric Barnes, his hands behind his back, his eyes on Helena. Poirot stared at the photo for a long time. He did not frame it. He did not file it. He simply returned it to the envelope and placed it back inside the drawer. Some truths, once known, are better left to sleep. Before bed, Poirot sat in his favourite armchair and opened his journal. He wrote only a single line. The door opened because someone needed it to, but it stayed closed because someone learned to face it. Then he closed the book and slept at peace.